This from the Ministry of Transport and Communication. I will be chairing this meeting of our decarbonization group on transport. I'm extremely happy to continue working within the framework of this group with the aim to renew the National Climate Change Action Plan with the aim to generate ideas and apply them later in practice. First of all, I would like to start by thanking the whole group of experts and consultants. They have been doing a very important work. And throughout the break in our meetings that we had, they managed to achieve quite a bit. First of all, I would like to share a few slides with you. Do you see my screen? I hope so. So this is what I will start with. First of all, I would like to mention the current stage of our cooperation. We are now working on the renewal of the National Energy and Climate Action Plan. It involves 5 stages. Our previous or last meeting took place in summer. It was stage 2 of our working process. At that time, we were working on new suggestions and proposals, so that on the basis of those proposals, we could actually develop a list of measures to reduce CO2 emissions and greenhouse gas emissions. And we received almost 200 suggestions and developed quite a big list of measures. And then our consultants selected 83 measures to assess and to do the benchmarking. Now we are in stage 3 of the National Energy Climate Action Plan review. And this stage will last till December. And the aim of this particular stage is to establish whether the list of measures that was developed by the ministry is sufficient to achieve the goals that we have set for ourselves. So we selected a list or developed a list of measures that we would like to include into the National Energy Climate Action Plan. And we think that the selected measures are the ones that will have the biggest effect on decarbonization. And our next step will be to hand them over to our experts to assess and see whether the impact will be sufficient. This meeting of today consists of 2 parts. During part 1 of the meeting, the experts of OECD will introduce their own findings to us, and they will speak about the results of their analysis related to climate neutrality. And we had a meeting with those same experts earlier this year. They introduced us to their initial steps under the framework of this project, and today they will continue speaking about this project and the outcomes of their work. So this will be part 1 of the meeting, and then part 2 will be devoted to the preliminary list of measures that is supposed to end up in the renewed National Energy and Climate Action Plan. I would also like to draw your attention that the presentation of OECD will be given in English. The consultants of the ministry will continue speaking Lithuanian, but we have interpreters participating in this meeting, and you're most welcome to use the interpretation function. Please click on the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen and turn on the interpretation function if you need it. Please switch off your microphones, and you may also switch off your cameras if you for the presentation. But when we have discussions, please turn on your camera, turn on your mic, and say whatever you want to say. One more thing to mention, the final report of OECD experts will be ready sometime later. It will be publicized and we will be able to look through it as well. That would be it from my side. Now the floor goes to OECD experts.
Good morning to everyone, and thank you so much, Larinas, for introducing us. So my name is Kilian Reza. I'm here with Anna Suyaraj and Asya Elguasem, and we're going to present to you the emerging findings from our analysis for this project. First of all, to kick off, thank you very much to our partners in Lithuania. It's been a pleasure coordinating and collaborating with you on this project, and thank you also to DG Reform for making it all possible. So with that said, I'm going to share my screen with you. I hope you can all see it. So today we're going to focus on what findings from our analysis that we've been carrying out over the last 9 months, what can we learn from this specifically for the transport sector? To do that, I'm going to provide you first with a brief sort of refresher on the project background for those of you who joined us in, I think, the end of January or beginning of February for the last workshop. Some of these slides may seem familiar, but I think it's good to just have a brief refresher of what the objectives of this project specifically were. Second, I'm going to provide you a very, very high level results from an economy-wide modeling study that was carried out as part of this project, just to give you an idea of what results our modeling found, and there's some implications in there for the transport sector as well. And then we'll dive really into what findings specific to the transport sector we have, and this will cover both the findings of our policy stocktake, of an analysis of the carbon pricing landscape in Lithuania, of a financial needs assessment, and of an assessment concerning innovation and technology adoption policies. We'll end with some policy recommendations and then have a half an hour for question and answers. So what is this project all about? As you can see from this chart, greenhouse gas emissions in Lithuania have broadly stalled since about 2009, maybe even 2005. Although some sectors, for example, the energy industry sectors, have reduced emissions quite considerably, this has been balanced out by increasing emissions elsewhere, for example, in transport. The other thing that we can see is that the emissions removals through carbon sinks has actually decreased since 2011, almost reaching levels of 2005 again in 2020. However, the EU has set a very ambitious EU-wide climate plan with the emissions reductions target of meeting net zero emissions by 2050 and 55% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 in order to achieve this. What does this mean for Lithuania? For example, the EU proposes to increase the ambition of its EU ETS from a 42% target in 2030 to a 61% target in 2030. It also proposes to update its effort sharing regulation, which focuses on non-ETS sectors. And here for Lithuania, this would mean that from a 9% target in 2030, so all non-ETS sectors would have to reduce their emissions by 9% compared to 2005 by 2030. It proposes to increase this to 21%. So as we can see from both the proposed increase of ambition in the EU ETS and in the effort sharing regulation, climate policy ambition in the EU and in Lithuania by extension is increasing quite significantly. The good news is that the Lithuanian government has so far been very much up to the task. Its national climate change and management agenda updates national targets for greenhouse gas emissions, also aiming to reduce emissions by 100% by 2050 compared to 1990 levels and 70% by 2030. Perhaps most striking in the national climate change management agenda is that non-ETS sectors are proposed to reduce emissions by around 25% by 2030. And this surpasses the 21% proposed by the EU. So in short, the Lithuanian government sets equally ambitious climate ambitions as the EU, if not surpassing these. However, in order to reach those ambitions, more needs to be done. If we consider the projected emissions reductions from current and additional measures in the current version of the NECP, we can see that these aren't quite enough to reach the economy-wide targets of the National Climate Change Management Agenda, nor the non-ETS target of the Effort Sharing Directive. This is where our project comes in. Lithuania needs to update its National Energy and Climate Plan next year, submitting it to the EU. And for that, an ongoing process that we are a part of has been launched. Our project aims to support this process by doing some analysis of how policy pathways for how Lithuania could meet its national climate change management agenda targets, how the new NECP could potentially learn from good practice examples in other OECD countries, and carrying out a number of direct analyses, for example, carrying out an economy-wide model of the Lithuanian economy to understand how different policy pathways, climate policy pathways might both affect emissions and sectoral makeup and sort of broad macroeconomic trends. Also carrying out a carbon pricing analysis to really understand how different emissions are priced in Lithuania or different fuels are priced in Lithuania and where there may be gaps. Carrying out an analysis of financial needs, particularly for infrastructure development, to really understand how the transition to net zero emissions can be financed. And then finally, we are currently also working on an analysis of the distributional impacts of carbon pricing in Lithuania, which the results of which are not quite yet ready, so they won't feature in this report, but they will in this presentation, but they will feature in the final report, which we aim to produce early next year. So just a brief overview of the different outputs. Output 3 of this project are these workshops where we present our emerging findings, and then we are currently working on finalizing the final report, and it needs to go through a couple of review cycles, but we aim to launch that early next year. So to start off with, I'd like to present you very quickly the headline results from our modeling analysis. Together with external consultants, we carried out a global computable general equilibrium model to assess the impact of decarbonization policy scenarios. And specifically, we looked at a couple of scenarios here. First of all, for the reference or baseline scenario, we assumed that the NDCs as communicated most recently are implemented in full. So important to note here is that this is not a business as usual scenario, but rather already entails quite a lot of climate ambition. However, we were then interested in looking at beyond what is already being communicated in the NDCs, what could Lithuania do to increase its ambition? Here we look at two scenarios. The first assumes that the rest of the EU reaches the EU's target, 55% reduction by 2030, and Lithuania implements the proposed excise duty amendment, whereby excise duties on most fuels would increase gradually to 2025, by which point then a carbon price component would be introduced, starting at 10 euros per ton and rising to 60 by 2030. In the second scenario to 2030, we look at a different approach, which is one where the EU sets an overall mechanism, namely a second EU ETS, specifically for the transport and building sectors. Now, this is currently being discussed at the EU level, although not without controversy. And we see that these are sort of two complementary approaches and it would be interesting to see the effect of both. Finally, looking beyond 2030, we model a high ambition scenario that assumes a very high carbon price trajectory to 2050 to try and understand what are the what results could we get from a high carbon price to 2050, how much emissions reductions would this achieve, and also what are the economic effects of this. There are two very important assumptions that this model makes that you need to bear in mind when considering its results. The first is that it assumes only current levels of technology. This is particularly important to 2050 because it's not an entirely realistic assumption. However, what it does show us is under what the current level of technology, assuming that no further innovation is possible, what could we achieve under a high carbon price? So in effect, it's sort of a lower bound estimate of results. And the second is that the model can only price combustion-based CO2 emissions, not process-based emissions. So economic costs and carbon prices may in fact be higher than they would be in reality if a full if process-based emissions could also be priced. Neither does the model consider other greenhouse gases. So considering these assumptions, what do we find? We find that under the reference scenario, emissions are not quite reduced enough to reach the 70% reduction in 2030 compared with 1990s levels. However, if we look at both the Fit 55 policy scenario, where Lithuania implements its excise duty amendment proposal, or the ETS2 scenario, where the EU implements a second ETS on the transport and building sector, we find that both of these have similar effects and meet the 2030 emissions reduction target. If we consider the scenario beyond 2030, you can see here that the carbon price would really increase quite a lot. And this is, based on marginal abatement cost curves. This is kind of the highest carbon pricing trajectory based on current technologies that would be possible beyond the price set in 2050. The marginal abatement gains become very negligible. And so considering this, what we find is that high carbon prices to 2050 would significantly decrease CO2 emissions, reaching an 83.4% reduction in CO2 emissions compared to 1990s level by 2050. However, if we consider all greenhouse gas emissions, not just CO2 under this scenario, we find that, in fact, high carbon pricing under current technology is not enough to really reach the net zero target, reaching only 65.3% reductions in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, this compared to 1919 levels. And if we consider the current trends of for carbon sinks, we could add another 5 megatons to this. The carbon sinks are not modeled in the model, so they don't appear in this graph, but that would still only lead us to 74% reduction. So the overall conclusions from our modeling exercise are that the excise tax amendment is key to meeting 2030 targets, especially if the ETS2 does not arrive. The economic costs of climate vision are low. For both the 2030 and the 2050 scenarios, we find that converted to annual growth rates, the slowdown would only be about 0.03 to 0.04%. And this isn't considering the economic co-benefits of climate action, for example, through reduced pollution, nor the avoided damages. And so actually, in fact, economic costs may be negative, or there may be a net benefit. And then finally, we find that innovation and technology diffusion is key, particularly in the industry, transport, and agricultural sectors. So if we go back to the graph, the three largest chunks of emissions that remain are in those three sectors: transport, industry, and agriculture. And here, in order to get to hard to abate sectors, we need new technologies, given that high carbon prices under current technological levels aren't enough. And with that, I'd like to very briefly share with you the results of our sector-specific policy stocktake, really looking at what's in the NECP at the moment and where do we see improvements to be made. So first of all, on an economy-wide level, there are a couple of horizontal policies, such as integrating greenhouse gas emissions reductions evaluations into legislative processes, mainstreaming climate within education, extending the scope for green procurement and raising public awareness, and also funding research. But we find that the most important economy-wide policy is actually the planned excise tax amendment, which proposes to gradually increase excise taxes on fuels, but exempting natural gas and up to a certain quota agricultural fuels used in the agriculture sector. And then from 2025, introduce a carbon price component, starting at 10 euros a ton and rising to 60 by 2030, with ETS installations exempt. In addition to the existing and planned economy-wide policy, there's also the EU Green Deal policy framework with all of the different legislative proposals under the Fit for 55 package. Now, if we consider the transport sector in particular, we find that emissions from private vehicles and from road freight are steadily increasing. But low fuel taxes and old and inefficient fleet requires both better price signals and financial incentives. We find that the vehicle fleet in Lithuania is amongst the oldest in the European Union, and that low fuel taxes in Lithuania enable that inefficient fleet. Now, the National Energy and Climate Plan in its current form details extensive financial incentives for fleet renewal and the purchase of low emissions vehicles. This includes, for example, a cash for clunkers program where you can trade in inefficient vehicles in exchange sort of for cash or money, and purchase subsidies for electric vehicles and charging station installation that aim to really push the uptake of low emissions vehicles. But such financial incentives are expensive. And here we find that increasing price signals and sort of also gaining revenue from prices would help limit the cost of fleet renewal and also generate revenues. Now, to consider the long-term policy needs, perhaps also with the 2050 horizon, we find that specifically in the transport sector, base erosion is an important challenge. Fuel tax income will decline as fleet renews and becomes electrified. And here we find from other countries that a distance tax would be an option potentially to overcome this. We'll also need more systemic policies, for example, addressing urban sprawl to avoid that fleet renewal benefits are cancelled out by just simply driving more. And then finally, hard to abate freight transport requires innovation and technology adoption. While there is some option for electrification of heavy duty vehicles and on the road especially, we still need to know more about the options of alternative fuels such as hydrogen or bio-based fuels. And for this, we require more direct support for deep innovation and also for technology adoption of not yet at market technologies. With that, I'd like to pass on to my colleague Anasuya to present the results of the carbon pricing landscape study.
Hi, can you hear me? So thank you very much for having us present our results. So today I'll present the results from the carbon pricing landscape from a sectoral perspective. So today on transport. If we move to the next slide. So the analysis in this section relies on the OECD effective carbon rates database, which measures how explicit carbon taxes, emissions trading systems, and fuel excise taxes put a price on CO2 emissions from energy use. So in Lithuania, CO2 emissions are covered through the EU ETS and excise duties that apply to most fuels and which are subject to the EU Energy Tax Directive, so the EU ETD, which sets minimum rates for the taxation of energy products in EU member states. So carbon tax doesn't exist yet, but has been under discussion. And in 2021, as Kilian mentioned at the beginning of the policy stocktake, the Lithuanian government proposed a draft law on excise duties, which would introduce a carbon tax component onto fuel excise taxes. So then establishing an effective carbon rate profile enables an analysis of the base, so which share of emissions are covered in Lithuania, and so today what will be important is in its transport sector, and an analysis of the rate, so that is how strong the price signal is. So in particular, two benchmark rates are used for the analysis. The first is a benchmark rate of 30 euros per ton of CO2, which represents the low-end price of carbon costs today to start triggering meaningful abatement efforts. And the second is 100 euros per ton of CO2, which according to a recent study by the European Commission is a central estimate of the social cost of carbon. So if we move on to the next slide, today the focus is on the transport sector in Lithuania, which is divided into road and off-road transport in the analysis. And what we see is that when leaving out CO2 emissions from the combustion of biomass, the road transport sector is the most important sector in terms of CO2 emissions from energy use in Lithuania. It represents more than half of emissions. The off-road transport sector, which is composed mostly of domestic navigation and aviation and pipeline transport, accounts for a very small share of emissions, but the price signal in both principally stems from fuel excise taxes with averages that are both above 100 euros per ton of CO2. So the next slides present a closer look at the two sectors. So carbon pricing in the road transport sector only stems from fuel excise taxes, which cover almost the whole sector, What can be observed, however, is a phenomenon that exists in most countries, the diesel differential or the diesel discount, which you can see here by comparing the rate in terms of euros per ton of CO2 between diesel and gasoline, and which arises because fuel excise rates in terms of euro per liter on diesel are much lower than on gasoline, with the relative difference, which is actually larger than the CO2 emissions that each fuel is responsible for. So this results in much lower rates in terms of euro per ton of CO2 for diesel, and disproportionately advantages this fuel. But despite this, effective carbon rates are above both benchmark rates of 30 and 100 euros per ton of CO2 in the whole road transport sector. They are higher on average than in the off-road transport sector in Lithuania, which doesn't rely on gasoline and which exempts part of its base. But they are actually, as Killian just said, amongst the lowest in the EU for the road sector. So, finally, something that's important to keep in mind also is that the high level of rates that can be observed in the sector might also reflect other externalities than the climate externalities, because road transport comes with externalities that have much more immediate impact, such as air pollution, accidents, congestion, and noise. Now, carbon pricing in the off-road transport sector almost entirely relies on fuel excise taxes as well. So here the EU ETS plays a small role because it covers domestic aviation, but this is only a very low share of off-road transport emissions in Lithuania. So the whole sector is covered except for diesel for domestic navigation and natural gas used for pipeline transport. And benchmark rates on priced emissions are met in 2021. So finally, moving on to the last slide, the analysis finds that the price signal in the road transport sector would be significantly strengthened by the implementation of the draft law on excise duties. So on the one hand, what this would result in would be to increase the fuel excise component on diesel and reduce the diesel differential. And on the other hand, the carbon tax component would by 2030 bring pricing levels to the highest rates that are observed today in the EU. So the introduction of an EU ETS2, so an emissions trading system on transport and heating fuels, would also strengthen the price signal if permit prices are sufficiently high. So as Killian mentioned, it's important to consider complementary policies also to increase the effectiveness of pricing by both preparing the transition to electric vehicles by the deployment of charging stations and also by increasing innovation incentives, which Asia will dive deeper into. And finally, the base erosion effect is important because today revenues from fuel excise taxes are important. So other revenue raising possibilities should be considered. So for example, distance-based charges, but also congestion charges are a possibility. And with that, I leave the floor to Asia.
Thank you, Anasuya. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having us and giving us the opportunity to present our results. Following up on what Anasuya just presented, yes, carbon pricing is going to be important, but it's not going to be enough. And therefore, my presentation is going to focus on the role that the public sector can play in scaling up climate finance in Lithuania to support the decarbonization. So next slide, please. Thus far, what we've seen is that the public sector has been the main driver for investment in low carbon transition, and it has relied heavily on distributing grants and subsidies to fund such investments. And these could, using grants and subsidies, while they're important sources of funding, they could potentially undermine incentives for private sector involvement and even crowd it out. the significant role of public sector investment that is especially coming from EU structural funds is quite large, and we've seen that over the last programming period in 2014 to 2020, Lithuania has spent around 6 billion euros in European structural funds, and these are representing 60% of its total public investment over the same period. So while the public sector will continue to be a key driver of infrastructure investment, its efforts will have to be complemented by the private sector, particularly because the investment needs for decarbonization exceed what the public sector can provide. And so the public sector has two roles. One is it's the provider of funds, but also it plays the role of the enabler, providing the conditions to scale up finance. So next slide, please. And so when it comes to its role, or how we can directly intervene to scale up public finance, one, the public sector needs to establish long-term policy and regulatory frameworks to boost investment. So this includes giving, the right signals to investors and to anchor their expectations, and also to provide necessary stability and certainty over the long run. Also, we know, as was mentioned before, that it is important for the public sector to provide the requisite investment, the infrastructure investment, for instance, for when it comes to the deployment of electric vehicles, by providing, charging stations to support the uptake of electric vehicles. And in Lithuania, we see that while the ambition to decarbonize transport is there, the implementation is not keeping pace with this ambition. So there needs to be more effort. Another way to increase or to make sure that climate finance is going into the right projects and is used efficiently is to increase the absorptive capacity in Lithuania of the structural funds that it receives. And this can be done by expanding the institutional capacity to absorb, and also to disperse the funds to the right projects. Also, increasing spending efficiency is a priority, and we suggest that, for instance, using financial instruments as part of the allocation of the EU structural funds could help in that to reach that objective. Also, building investment-ready and bankable project pipelines is another way to attract investors, as it gives them a set of projects to invest in instead of just a one-off investment opportunity, and this would allow them to build the capacity to do so. Lastly, engaging subnational authorities is going to be important, as the local governments are heavily involved in implementing infrastructure projects. And so engaging them and perhaps, given the small size of Lithuania, try to find pooling mechanisms to scale up finance is one way to do that. So next slide, please. Another characteristic in Lithuania is that it's a small market, and one way to see that is to look at the assets under management held by institutional investors in the Baltic states. So the left figure shows such order of magnitude, and we see that the assets under management in institutional investment institutions, is much higher than the size of the capital markets, so the equity and bond markets in the three Baltic states. So working towards reaching critical size by integrating the Baltic capital markets is welcomed and encouraged, and we hope that progress in this area continues. We also think that there is scope to require mechanisms that influence incentives and behaviors in financial markets, including the requirement of green mandates and the clarification of the fiduciary duty with respect to climate risk. This also contributes to perhaps expanding the use of green bonds, which we see in Lithuania is quite limited at this point compared to other countries, and so there's scope to extend the use of such financial instruments to support decarbonization. Next slide, please. Another way that the private sector can help crowd in private investment is to develop risk-sharing mechanisms that achieve an appropriate allocation of risk between the public and private parties. We know that risks evolve over the life cycle of a project, and they and therefore we need to provide investors with financial solutions or financial instruments that are tailored to their risk appetite. And so governments can make sure that the regulation is aligned with providing a sufficient variety of financial solutions to investors. And next slide, please. So my last slide hones in on a specific program that showed quite significant success in drawing private investors. This is the Jessica program that started in 2007, but the second iteration was over the last programming period between 2014 and 2020. And this is a program that aims to improve energy efficiency in the residential sector. And there are many takeaways from this sector, from this program, but really what we've seen is that it takes a lot of time, almost 2 decades to develop the technical expertise and administrative capacity to not only evaluate projects, but also to implement, to process funds and find financial solutions that are appropriate for the type of risk facing the improvements in energy efficiency. And so we think that it's important to look at this program and to see what were the barriers and what were the solutions to overcome the challenge. We see also that leveraging the experience of experienced financial intermediaries, as well as leveraging the experience of multilateral banks that are involved, such as the European Investment Bank, which is important in managing and dispersing such funds. And also that providing technical assistance throughout the life cycle of the project and to the relevant stakeholders played a key part in the success of the project. And with this, I conclude my part and pass it to Killian for the last slide.
Thanks so much, Asya and Anasuya. And so just to sort of briefly sum up, what we find is that extensive fleet renewal subsidies are important, but infrastructure, transport system design, and pricing all need to catch up. And so basically the NECP in its current form already has very extensive subsidies for fleet renewal and direct support for installing charging stations with pretty strong targets for electric vehicle and charging station rollout. However, pricing signals can be improved, for example, through the implementation of an excise duty amendment, or also for support for the ETS2 at the European level. And high prices can both provide key revenue streams, for example, that can feed back into funding expensive fleet renewal subsidies. But here also base erosion should be considered, and long-term plans should be made to shore up government revenues. However, prices will not be enough, and innovation and infrastructure development will be key, with new technologies needed in hard-to-abate emissions, such as in freight transport. But also electrification will require huge infrastructural investment, and efficient public spending to engage private sector involvement here is key, specifically also with capacity building, a key aspect of this. But finally, just on a sort of final note, is that transport systems also need to be considered more holistically. simply decarbonizing the transport fleet may not be enough if the distance driven is not also curtailed. And we need more systemic solutions, particularly in redesigning both urban and rural transport systems, but also just urban and rural areas more generally. And the OECD is doing some very interesting work in this regard on sort of transport systems redesign. There was a recent report that was launched focusing specifically on the case of Ireland. And here really what the OECD's work has found is that, equally important to ensuring electric vehicle rollout and all of this is to tackle issues like urban sprawl, but also accessibility to key amenities within cities and rural areas. So making sure that the distance that people have to travel to get to the supermarket, the hospital, school, and work is short enough, for example, that they can take alternative modes of transport to private vehicles. And with that, I'd like to thank you all. Sorry, we went a little bit over time, I think, but we still have 20 minutes for discussion. And we'd like to ask you to really sort of what would be most interesting for us as far as questions and comments is, is there something that perhaps from your expertise, you are the real experts on the Lithuanian transport sector, what might we have missed? And overall, from sort of your view, what aspects of our sort of findings and recommendations do you find most interesting? And I look forward to hearing those questions.
Tai pirmiausia, turbūt aš norėčiau padėkoti Europos komisijos ir EBPO ekspertams už labai išsamų projektų rezultatų pristatymą.
First of all, thank you very much for such an exhaustive presentation. Most of us would be eager to get in greater detail of your report once you have the final report ready. And we're looking forward to your final report to analyze it in detail. I'm sure we will be able to base our decisions on the outcomes of your report when we discuss other ways or additional ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the future to achieve those ambitious goals. And now I invite everyone to ask questions or to comment. We already have one hand up. Zigmas, the floor is yours. I'm sorry to say something is wrong with the sound. The chairperson also made the same comment about the sound. Well, Zigmas is taking care of the connection. There might be other questions, please. I don't see any hands yet. Well, what does that mean? Most probably, this means that the presentation was really exhaustive and provided in great detail, and there are no questions as a result. But now I would like to ask my colleagues from the Ministry of Environment. Shall we say that part 1 is over and we should start with part 2? If we have no questions or comments. Zigmas is back. Good morning. Can you hear me now? Yes, we can. Thank you very much, dear colleagues from OECD, for your presentation. I'm always pleased to see you. I have one question. I was saddened by one fact, that your insights often speak about additional taxes. Every time when people hear additional taxes upcoming, they feel sad. But when we speak about combustion engines, we say that combustion engines can eliminate, or eliminated combustion engines can eliminate CO2 to a greater extent than eliminating something else. But if we include everything, including the production of a particular transport, then if we include all the emissions, I am not sure whether the elimination of combustion engines would result in greater reduction of CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions in comparison to hydrogen, for example, engines, because we first of all need to take into consideration the emissions related to the production of a particular type of transport. And some new types of transport might involve great emissions, even greater than the ones that are related to the production of combustion engines. Lithuania can only produce 30% of its electricity needed, and we have cosmic prices of electricity in Lithuania. Currently, they are really huge. And if we introduce more of electric vehicles, the need for electricity will grow by 3 times. And already now we are importing electricity. Quite a bit of electricity is being imported. And in the future, we will need to import even more in order to meet that need. And even the production of those new means of transport or types of transport is not that sustainable. And if we compare the salaries of our population here in Lithuania with the salaries in other countries, we will see that they're really low, especially in rural areas. And if we speak about electric vehicles, this brings us to the point where it becomes impossible to introduce electric vehicles, knowing that electricity prices are growing, that the salaries are low and electricity needs are not met. So as a result, with all those increasing taxes, we will have to walk on foot everywhere instead of driving at all. If we start producing electric vehicles here in Lithuania, and if we find an alternative to lithium batteries, most probably it might be possible to implement the things that you suggested. Thank you very much. Thank you, Zygmunt, for your question and for your insights. Would our guest like to respond?
Sure, yes, thank you, Zygmunt. Also a pleasure from our side to see you again. And thanks again for your very pertinent questions. Always happy to engage in these discussions. And I mean, you're completely right. So first of all, we speak about raising taxes. Nobody likes to be told that taxes are going to be raised. But there are a number of policy options to limit the sort of tax burden on households. So, for example, investing, having the public invest, but also engaging private investment, but also engaging through regulation can help reduce the sort of necessary tax increases. And perhaps most importantly, taxes also generate revenues that can be redistributed back to households. And our modeling does this, sort of in our general equilibrium model. What we do is we just all revenues through higher taxes or through carbon prices are given directly back to households. And what we find is that actually the distributional impacts of this are pretty negligible, and the overall economic costs as well. So I do think that higher taxes can be, they don't necessarily need to mean higher burdens on households. And in the final report that will come out next year, you'll also see a sort of more detailed analysis of the distributional impacts of higher taxes. Now, moving on from the sort of tax questions, it is true that electric vehicles aren't necessarily environmentally friendly. There are sort of certain environmental externalities beyond just emissions that are involved in the production of EVs. And those, there's work being done on that field, for example, in the circular economy, trying to figure out how to better recycle batteries, but also battery technology is becoming increasingly efficient. And so perhaps the need for lithium over the next 10 years is going to decrease so significantly, or a new sort of alloy will be found that can play the same role. The question remains whether or not alternative fuels are better. And here, this isn't part of our study necessarily, and I'm sure there is work at the OECD, but it's also important to consider that the electric vehicle transition has sort of started at least 10 years ago, and infrastructure is already being built up. And given the speed with which emissions do need to be reduced, I do think that electrifying, particularly private vehicles, is probably the best and most cost-effective option at this point, given that hydrogen vehicles aren't yet at market and infrastructure for hydrogen isn't yet there. What's more, as you talk about the increase in energy demand, producing green hydrogen is incredibly energy intensive and requires huge amounts of renewable energy capacity. That said, Lithuania does intend to increase its capacity by up to 5%, 5 times. So, the energy demand increases will be met by more energy supply. And what's also key here is to, remain open to trade. I think there are countries that have limited capacity as far as producing electricity is concerned. And beyond the capacity of those countries, they'll need to import electricity, and especially within the EU framework, that should be a key reason to keep the EU strong and sort of united, because there are other countries within the EU that have higher capacity to produce renewable electricity. Finally, on the electricity prices currently, I think what's really important to remember here is that electricity prices are high because there's a shortfall of fossil fuel. And fossil fuel prices are high, not renewable electricity prices. So if we're considering a long-term transition to renewable energy and to decarbonization, what we'll probably find is greater energy security, and through it also more stable electricity prices that remain low. And hopefully the current temporary price increase will as geopolitical tensions unfold, and perhaps calm down, but also as countries ramp up their renewable energy production, these price increases will go back down, and a sort of low electricity price future is ahead. I don't know if my colleagues have anything else to add.
I would like to add. Thank you, Kilian, for your exhaustive answer and insights. And I see our colleague Aiste willing to say a few more words. Aiste, can you hear me? Yes, we can. Thank you very much for your presentations. Thank you very much for your question and your comments. I would like to draw your attention to one more thing. We have another important event going on, the TIF Forum here in Lithuania. And we have both Lithuanian and world-class presenters participating. And most probably we shouldn't be questioning the issue of electric vehicles. It has already been approved globally. Now, what we are doing now here in Lithuania is we're working on the National Energy and Climate Action Plan, which is supposed to enable us to ensure a smooth transition to electric vehicles. And we are now discussing all the measures that are needed. And among them, we also have taxes and also other measures meant for socially vulnerable groups, including social taxes and public transport and a number of other issues. And I wouldn't like to come back to those issues time and again. If you have any questions of the kind, you're most welcome to call me or Laurinas for further discussions. But we shouldn't question the transition to electric vehicles anymore. And our key goal was to include all the measures in the National Energy and Climate Action Plan that would allow us to make that transition to the transport measures that would reduce greenhouse gases. And one of our goals is to have a holistic list of measures. Some of them are really not attractive, like taxes. Some others are much more attractive. In some cases, for the time being, we do not have a possibility to apply those measures, but they have to be on the list. And with time, this might be possible. Thank you very much, Aiste, for your insights. And now I will give the floor to Mantas, and then Zigmas will want to say something in addition to Mantas. Thank you. I would like to thank Aiste and others. I am a representative of the Ministry of Environment. We have been working on the renewal of NEC, National Energy Climate Action Plan. And we identified that the use of fossil fuel in the transport sector has a lot of impact on greenhouse gas emissions because greenhouse gases are emitted both at the extraction point, at the transportation point, and at the usage point. And we use it for kinetic energy in transportation vehicles. And this cycle is ongoing. So throughout the life cycle of fossil fuel, we generate a lot of greenhouse gases. And those amounts are much bigger as compared to other types of fuel. And it has already been mentioned that we are now working on the circular economy plan for Lithuania as well. We are discussing ways to enable faster transition to circular economy, including the reuse of batteries. And the final question related to electricity production, energy production. We will have a meeting with the Ministry of Energy soon, and we will discuss the measures related to the energy sector that are to be included in the National Energy and Climate Action Plan. And our goal is to make sure that we are able to produce 100% of the energy that is needed for this transition to a new situation. But it's not up to me to comment it now. Thank you very much for your additional comments in reply to Zigma's questions, and I will now give the floor to Zigmas once again. Zigmas, we cannot hear you. Now we can hear you. Finally, I managed to turn on my sound. Well, to continue the discussion for a while on the topic that was mentioned by Mantas and by Aiste, I haven't seen any of the calculations that Mantas was talking about, but what concerns the electrification of transport and the need for energy, or for electricity, I would be really glad to see what the Ministry of Energy could offer to us to ensure that we produce 4 times more of electricity, because our capacity now amounts to only 30% of the current needs, which do not include the new needs of electric vehicles. And if we decide to switch to electrification, our need will grow 4 times, and we do not have the capacity to generate it all. And the research that is available to us shows that if we use modern technologies for electrification, then it will be inefficient at all to get rid of combustion engines and to use electric engines only. Especially if we speak about the production of batteries. If we use organic material, then everything is fine. But the current technologies of battery production are absurd. Thank you. Would you like to react to Zigma's question, Andrus? Would anyone like to react to the comments made by Zigmas, the recent comments made by Zigmas? No. If not, then thank you very much, Zigmas, for all the comments that you shared with us. Thank you for saving our discussion. And now I see Andrus raising his hand. Thank you very much, OECD, to the OECD representatives. I noted in one of the slides that you mentioned Lithuania among the outsiders, and irrespective of the fact that we have all kinds of incentives, for example, subsidies for electric vehicles, free of charge charging and so on, we are still outsiders in terms of electric vehicles. And just like the colleagues from OECD mentioned, the measures that we apply do not work. What would be your suggestions for Lithuania? What kind of incentives, fiscal or other incentives, would allow us to achieve those 2% from which the real growth starts? You provided the Norwegian example, and When you reach those 2%, then within 2 years, you can achieve a growth of 10%. And then in the UK, also reached the 2%, and then the growth started as well there. So how can we achieve those 2% where we would have a breakthrough happening? So what else should our country do in order to achieve those 2% in electrification and to be taken off the list of outsiders in terms of electric vehicles? Thank you. Could our guest react?
Sure. Asia, do you want to answer this? Because I think this is really all about financing for infrastructure that's really key.
Yes, so I mean, what we see is that it's not enough to provide subsidies and to help households with the purchasing of electric vehicles. What will be important is to, on the one hand, provide the infrastructure that is necessary to support electric vehicle deployment, which means that public and private finance will need to be scaled up to support the infrastructure development. At the same time, as Sigmas has been emphasizing, is the expansion of the electric grid to support the electrification of transport. So, and this again will need not only public sector investment, but also the private sector to come in, because there is a significant financing gap that emerges
I don't know.
Turbūt praradome ryšį su mūsų eksperte.
Seems like we lost connection with
Yes.
our OECD expert.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay,
Would
great.
you like
Well,
to
then
continue?
I don't know, perhaps Asia had some issues on her side. So just to reiterate Asia's point that, so, you know, sort of the most important thing for enabling a switch to electric vehicles is to really create sort of framework conditions to allow that to happen. If you're a household that's considering buying an electric vehicle, you'll probably only do so if on your regular sort of commute and also the regular trips you make, perhaps to visit family in a different part of the country, you are sure that there's enough electric vehicle charging stations on that way for you to be able to get there easily. And if you don't see that infrastructure there, then you're unlikely to take the plunge. So the first movers are those that, you know, can afford it, but also who, you know, perhaps are in the urban centers where electric vehicle charging infrastructure is already sort of slowly coming to be. But what's really key from a sort of public sector point of view is to sort of start financing both directly from public funds, but also through enabling private investment in this, the infrastructure development that is necessary to sort of provide framework conditions for electric vehicle expansion. And I think the other thing that's really important here as well is to consider from a public sector point of view, you know, how much of the driving that you want to electrify is really necessary. And are there alternative means to be able to ensure the sort of mobility and accessibility to different amenities for people without necessarily offering electric vehicle, you know, private vehicle charging infrastructure. And, you know, I think that combining the two, both rolling out infrastructure investment, both on the public and private side as much as possible, but also considering more systemic approaches, for example, to, you know, building better cycling infrastructure and ensuring that shops and other amenities are close enough to cycle to, they can help in tandem with both reducing the demand for electric vehicles and ensuring that where there is demand, supply is sort of can meet that. I hope that that answered your question, Anders.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Taip, tai ačiū labai, Kilianai, už atsakymą.
Thank you very much, Kilian, for your answer. And I think looking at the time, looking at the agenda, and we probably have to proceed. And thank you very much again for our guests from European Commission and OECD for sharing the results of the project. And we are now switching to the second part of this meeting, where the consultants of the Ministry of Environment are going to present the list of measures that they have selected. Thank you very much for the consultants of OECD. And let's now switch to the second part of this meeting. Hello, everyone. I'm Aiste Jotautite from PricewaterhouseCoopers, and thank you very much, Laurynas. I'm going to show you the measures. Can you see my slides? Perfect. So we will start with the process itself. I will remind you very briefly of the process, since you probably know this process quite well, but this in all sectors, it consisted of two stages. In the first stage, we collected the proposals from social partners, based on which we made a list of measures, described them, we established the technological potential, financial potential, and so on. In the second part, we did the assessment of the measures, which consisted of several stages. So, for example, impact on greenhouse gases, impact on fuel and energy savings, impact on jobs and social exclusion. In the third phase, we have ongoing discussions with ministries, questions, answers, where ministries are deciding upon the implementation of measures and the necessary funding. Now, speaking of the transport sector, in specific, after making up the list of measures, we have understood that there are a lot of measures that were important. In total, we came up with 86 new measures for the transport sector. And for today, we are planning to include 39 into the plan. 22 measures are still questionable, and the final decisions are not made regarding these 22 measures. And for the transport sector, we're going to continue a lot of work that has started already. So we are planning to continue 17 measures that were launched previously in the previous NECP. And what I'm going to present you with today is 56 measures in 14 thematic areas. So get ready, there will be a lot of slides. As I've mentioned, some measures are still being discussed, so this list is not final yet. So in each of the thematic area, you will see such tables where you will be able to see the code of the measure, the title of the measure, the type of it, the maximum savings on greenhouse gases, other criteria, and the necessary funding. On the right side of the slide, you will see the necessary funding for the new, also for the existing measures, and so the funding needed to implement these measures. So we will start with the railways. So we are planning to implement 10 new measures here. On this slide, you see the measures that are a bit more efficient in terms of greenhouse gas savings. So these measures are related to railway electrification. Also, we are planning a pilot hydrogen train, and also renovation of services of railways. So, for example, smart tickets, and adaptation of trains according to universal design principles. Other 4 measures, maybe they're not that efficient in terms of greenhouse gas savings, but they're important for the future. For the future, so these are related to the maintenance and development of railway infrastructure. So 2 measures are 2 direct routes, Vilnius-Warsaw and Vilnius-Riga, and as I've mentioned, maintenance. In this area, in the railway thematic area, we also are planning to continue the existing measures. So the railway electrification and renovation of infrastructure, just to adapt the tracks of rails. Another thematic area, intermodal freight transport. So we have 2 measures here, and one of the measures implies quite big greenhouse gas savings, and this is intermodal freight transport by diversification the services portfolio and technical maintenance of Vilnius and Kaunas intermodal hubs. Another area, another thematic area, that's public transport, and we are planning several new measures. The first one is the renovation of public transport fleet. And the other measure is the development of infrastructure, meaning for infrastructure for charging, if we're talking about electric transport. We are planning to continue 3 measures under this thematic area. That is the renovation of public transport fleets by encouraging vehicles that run on alternative fuel or electricity. Sustainable mobility in cities, that is related to transport infrastructure and system in city, and also the development of sustainable mobility plans. We have 2 measures in the freight transport thematic area. One measure speaks about the purchases, the incentives for purchases of freight vehicles, and the other measure is the former measure P30E. That is like a renovation of the previous measure, and that is the development of alternative fuel charging stations. Now, another thematic area, EV charging infrastructure. In principle, we are planning to continue 2 existing measures. That is the development of public infrastructure, charging infrastructure, and private infrastructure development. And these are the 2 measures. In this in the first measure, in 13.5E, we have more proposals. We have a more detailed description of this measure, and some of the descriptions are new. So we have more activities here. So the measure is existing. I mean, we continue this, but we have new activities here. For example, charging stations next to national roads, highways, also in coach stations, railway stations, and airports. So this measure covers a lot of activities, a lot of areas. Now, another thematic area, electric vehicles. We're planning a new measure here, that is the promotion of using electric vehicles. Although this measure is new, it covers all it covers three former measures, which are also called promoting the use of electric vehicles. And those measures were involved subsidies to used or second-hand electric vehicles and new electric vehicles. Low emission transport means another thematic area. We're planning to continue the existing measures, and these all the measures are called financial incentives to choose less polluting mobility measures. So these measures are aimed at incentives to buy, for example, electric scooters, public transport tickets, and also less polluting vehicles. In the bicycle thematic area, we have 4 measures that cover the entire cycle. That is what is needed for the development of cycling culture in Lithuania. So first of all, subsidies to purchasing of bicycles, also support for maintenance of bicycles, then storage facilities for bicycles, and bicycle tracks. That is the installation of new ones and renovation of the existing ones. And now another area is domestic shipping, and we have 5 measures here. The measures are aimed at purchasing new freight ships, as well as barges, as well as ferries, and also we speak about the adaptation of infrastructure, like, for example, T18, measure T18 speaks about the modernization and the development of the infrastructure of inland shipping. Maritime shipping, here we speak about electricity providing to ships that are at the Klaipėda port, and also providing the infrastructure for electricity. Aviation, another thematic area. We have 4 new measures here. Some of them involve infrastructure. For example, T74, that is the provision of sustainable aviation fuels. Fuels infrastructure, also, for example, T76, that is the electrification of parking lots for airplanes, and also the adaptation and development of infrastructure. Another thematic area, tax and control. Here we have planned 6 new measures into this thematic area. They are quite different, and they do not indicate any greenhouse gas savings, but they are dedicated to enable the choice of cleaner technologies in the future. These are measures involve fiscal measures, let's say various road transport tax reliefs. One measure is research area, that is the developing the laboratory of transport pollution, for transport pollution. Then also freight transport with less polluting vehicles, developing measures, developing necessary regulatory instruments for this promotion. educational measure, for example, T60, that is social dissemination, raising public awareness, changing and developing behaviors. Or for example, regulatory measures, the renovation of fleets, by applying the green purchases and by ensuring the necessary public procurement goals in the transport sector. Or another one is reducing traffic jams by applying traffic regulation solutions. Also in this area, we're planning to continue 5 existing measures. That is the annual car pollution tax. Also, some of them are e-tolling implementation in the freight transport sector. Also, sustainable transport, sustainable mobility foundation development. Low pollution zones, another thematic area. And that's a regulatory measure, developing zones of low pollution in cities. Economical driving, thematic area, 2 measures of educational type. One is continuous, that is promotion of and development of economical driving skills. So as I've mentioned in the beginning, 22 measures are still under discussion, and the decisions haven't been adopted regarding these measures. And very briefly, I will try to be brief. I will now talk about 25 measures that we are not planning to implement and include into an ACP. The majority of these measures is simply they are simply related to areas that have already measures. So we just simply want to avoid overlapping. That's why we decided to not include some of the measures, for example, T7, T53, T29, or other ones. And these measures talk about the alternative fuels, or for example, T67, T16. They are related to improvement of attractiveness of public transport, and actually we have this measure already included. Sustainable mobility plans in city, these measures are also included. Some of these measures are related to the development of public and private charging stations. As I've mentioned already, we have the measure already that covers the development of such network, such infrastructure. And there are a lot of measures in this list related to pollution tax for cars, also of ecological driving skills development, and so on. So we have already covered them. Also, the reasons why we haven't included some of the measures are related to the existing regulation. For example, T64, T65, 66. And there are a couple of measures that per se focus not on the reduction of greenhouse gases, but air pollution, for example. For example, T64, their nature suggests that they focus on different goals rather than reduction of CO2 emissions, so greenhouse gas emissions. So we are going to propose to include them in other plans. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for your attention. And I'll be looking forward to your questions. Aiste, thank you very much for such an exhaustive presentation about the measures, about what we have chosen, and what measures are still under the discussion, what we want to see in NECP, what we don't want to see it. I can see that Rimantas is raising his hand, so please, Rimantas, the floor is yours. Colleagues, thank you very much. You did a great job. We have a lot of measures, but I just wanted to pay your attention to one nuance. We probably missed out on one thing, and I just wanted to raise a question. Where are we going to include this aspect? So a lot of measures will need control, monitoring in one way or another, both on a local level and maybe on a national level. And for example, right now I have an innovative project, and now we have to deal with the regulatory framework about the monitoring, how we're going to implement the monitoring. And however, the monitoring, the legal framework on monitoring is decided upon, is developed by other authorities, for example, Ministry of Interior. So we are kind of stuck. We want to make a project, we want to make better, let's say, things. However, we find ourselves in kind of a deadlock. So, and this is where discussions start. Who should do that? What regulations, what regulatory framework should be applied? What laws should be applied? Who should do that? Is it, for example, the project that I'm talking about is police? Maybe police department should do that. Maybe municipalities should do that. So maybe we should discuss this aspect as well, and maybe we have to coordinate it with the Ministry of Interior, maybe with the Ministry of Environment, because we might have the situation where three, let's say, agencies, three ministries will be involved. So we have to discuss that in advance. That's my wish and my kind of request, my insight. I can see that Mantas has joined us. Maybe Mantas will want to react. So Mantas, please. Rimantas, thank you very much for your observation. Yes, while analyzing the whole package of measures, we also paid attention to the fact that in some cases and for some measures, we need to think about regulation in more detail. And now we are having discussions about these measures and on the coordination between the ministries. And as you said, there might be the case that we will have three ministries involved in the process. So this is one of the reasons why we haven't adopted the final solutions regarding some of the measures, especially of the regulatory type. So thank you very much for your observation. We see that as well. Arturas is raising his hand, please. Road maintenance. I'm from road maintenance. Sigma's, well, I just wanted to reply, or maybe to add to what Sigmas has previously said about the infrastructure. The measures that focus on electric vehicles, less polluting freight vehicles or electric vehicles. So when we talk about heavy transport, based on the current technologies we have to actually to install additional weight on the car itself, on the vehicle itself, so that we can have, let's for example, a battery. It really weighs a lot, and it's the vehicle becomes very, very heavy. And we have to take that into account, that the weight of the vehicle may have an influence. I mean, it may have an influence on our plans. Electric vehicles, for example, you talked about the measures in T13, T61, promotion of using electric vehicles. So I understand that in these measures, you're talking about cars, but I think you should also include into those measures heavy transport as well. So we are talking to the big producers of heavy transport, and we're always in contact with their R&D departments, and we're looking for, we're discussing with them what solutions are available. So so I think we should also cover not only lightweight transport but also heavy transport, like different classes of transport. And then it will have a different, it will have a different, different funding implications, because, for example, to buy an electric heavy vehicle, it really costs you a lot of money. Other measures like P56, green purchases, we also have to think about the finances, where to get the money from. The companies have to think about that all the time. For example, right now, I wouldn't see any opportunities to buy, let's say, new vehicles, electric vehicles. So financing, I think, is the issue, and there are restrictions in this regard. So I think we have to review it. It's not everything. Everything is not that great. It's not that perfect. We have to. I mean, the business simply doesn't have the money just to. It sounds very nice on paper, yes, switching to green, but it's quite difficult. It's a big burden for the business. Another thing, the funding. If the majority of measures, for the majority of measures, it is foreseen that that public institutions, municipal institutions will provide the funding. We have a lot of companies that are governed by the state. Those are the companies, the main shareholder of which is the state. And these companies are not included. They will probably not receive the funding, the public funding that is foreseen. However, they have to stick to the green requirements, because state is the biggest shareholder of these companies. So the requirements apply to these companies. So these companies, the like semi-private, semi-public companies, are nowhere covered in these measures. And some of the measures will not apply to big companies that have more than several hundred employees. So on my side, I really want to be this like flag carrier, but I cannot do that because of regulatory framework. A lot of pollution comes from the construction equipment, transport that is used in construction, which is not covered as well in these measures. Maybe we can also include that into the plan. So these vehicles that are used in construction industry, they're really polluting, and so far we have no alternative. So maybe we can also think about that as well. There's a lot of such transport. I can see Rasa has commented. Okay, probably Russ's comment is not for me. So that these are my insights. We have a lot of questions. The idea is very good. The plan is very good. It's good that we have developed it, but there are a lot of questions that still have to be answered. Arturas, thank you very much for your questions and for your insights. I can see that ISTA, probably from the Ministry of Transport and Communication, will respond about green purchase. Maybe Ala will answer that question. Laurinas, you had so many questions that I actually got lost. So Arturas, you can always call us, you can always contact us, but as far as I understand, we have that we are in a situation that, and correct me if I'm wrong, so we are in a situation that where we're collecting the needs of social partners, and we have analyzed them, and this is the final version. So is this because this stage, this phase of providing proposals, of providing your suggestions is over. So because when I listen to your insights, it seems to me that we're going back to the phase where social partners provide their views. So let's not get involved into this discussion for the interest of time. And if you have any further questions, if you want to discuss, just contact me. Yes, we collected all the measures, we analyzed them, and we systemized them. The majority of questions that were posed by Arturas are related to the description of measures. And through that prism of the Ministry of Environment, we just look at the number of measures that will have to be implemented, whether by public institutions, private institutions, and so on. So these questions will have to be raised once the funding is received. So we're now talking about the general blocks, general list of measures. We have the measures for, let's say, freight transport, sea transport, railway transport, and later on inside, we will, I mean, it's outside the scope of this working group. This is not in the scope of planning. The plan was to collect the best measures to reach the decarbonization targets and to achieve greenhouse gas emission objectives. And some of the measures, yeah, you're talking about, let's say, calls for proposals, and these are separate regulatory things, and we're not looking at this today. And this is the purpose of the plan. We have to just get the general picture of the market and what we have to do in each area of the market. So the majority of the measures are interrelated, and let's say you're talking about monitoring, control, who's responsible. Yeah, we have several ministries that are responsible, and we have to cooperate. These ministries will have to cooperate, and this is something that we are doing. Other ministries are doing this, and responding to ISTA, yeah, so today we have collected all the measures. We looked at the major areas, the major blocks, and what the Ministry of we see that the measures, even those that are not aimed at the savings of greenhouse gases, they also are needed because they provide the synergies. Even if those measures are not aimed at reducing the emissions, but we need these measures because if we don't include that measure, we will face certain problems in the future. So they are necessary. For example, various measures, regulatory measures. Sometimes, of course, you cannot define each legal act so much in detail. So we're just looking at the general picture and the directions towards which we have to move in each of the transport sector. Mantas. Thank you very much. Just wanted to add regarding the construction transport. We actually have 12 measures that focus on construction sector. And all of these 12 measures are covered by the industry working group. So one of these measures is CO2 reduction and utilization in the construction industry. So we're talking about the production and disposal processes. So regarding this measure, we haven't made the final decision. It's still in the process of coordination between different ministries, but it could be one of the measures, and that kind of probably responds to your question about the construction vehicles.
Vis tiek truputį tą pačią temą uždarant, tai iš principo iš to, Raistai, ačiū, gal aš šiek tiek per daug ir išvardinau, tiesiog sakau, kad yra problemų ir norėtųsi tikslinti. Tai aš vis tik tai norėčiau suprasti tada, galvoju, 13 ten skaidrė buvo, elektromobilių naudojimo skatinimas, kad vis tik tai konkrečiau kalbėtumėm apie kokiuos, nes aš turiu įspūdį šitų priemonių, kad mes kalbam pagrindę apie lengvąjį transportą. Tai galbūt patikslintim šitas priemonės siūlomas ir skaidrės, nes apie sunkųjį turbūt nekalbam. Ir panašiai dar vienas yra, kad tam transportui aš matau priemonės yra, nežinau, tik siūlymą pateiksiu dar papildomai, bet yra kalbam apie įdiegimą elektromobilių, įkrovimo stotelių, bet jų ir palaikymas. Tai jeigu sunkvežimiam įkrauti elektromobilio stotelę, reikia, taip grubiai 500 ar ne kilovatų galios, tai yra kosminiai pinigai už galią mokami ir šitoje vietoje tiesiog aš galvočiau, kad ne tik turėtų eiti jų įrengimo, bet ir palaikymo, lygiagrečiai skatinimas. Tai turbūt tiek iš mano temų.
Ačiū Artūrai. Aiste, norėsit sureaguoti turbūt? Prašau.
Dėkui. Tai jeigu ten apie tas skaidrės, dabar neprisimenu, kurie ten slaidai, bet...
Thank you very much. I do not remember now which slides you are talking about, but there was a differentiation between heavy transport, which includes all categories except M1 and A1, and then the other slide was related to the light transport. And according to the currently approved financing, the money was allocated for light transport, including electric vehicles and hydrogen-powered vehicles. Then the second part is meant for heavy vehicles, which are electric vehicles, methane, or hydrogen vehicles. And we also participated in discussions by the European Commission, which should include SNG and LNG, but the European Commission said that this cannot be compensated from the EU money, but most probably this is not the time for discussion now. Sometime in the future, we will have new suggestion for financing, and we already promised to our social partners that we will involve them in those discussions in order to make sure that all the solutions that are suggested are convenient for all of us. We have indicators set by the EU, and if our financing suggestions are not attractive enough, no one will make use of those financing suggestions. So we need to make sure that we receive adequate support and that it is accessible. What concerns charging stations or charging points, I do see that there are different opinions. Some say that we need compensation for the capacity because we do need to ensure that the charging stations are have sufficient capacity for trucks as well, but some others say that operators should be the one to take care of the maintenance of the charging stations as well, and this would generate additional benefit. Yesterday, I spoke to one of the representatives who said they do not agree with the compensation of the capacity. Now, what concerns heavy transport, freight transport, we need to establish this infrastructure, charging infrastructure next to the roads of national importance, because this infrastructure for heavy transport is only used on those main roads of national importance, but not in urban areas. And for that, we have foreseen to use EU support. And we will have separate descriptions for that, and we will then discuss with social partners on where those charging stations for heavy transports are to be established, and so on and so forth. So this issue of charging infrastructure will come up in the foreseeable future, and we will involve our social partners in the discussion in the future on the topic. Thank you very much. I see Zigmas raising his hand. Thank you for your patience, and thank you, Aiste, for the introduction of all the measures that have already been developed. And I liked the words of Ronas, who said it sounds nice, it sounds good and attractive, but it's not enough just to sound attractive. You also said, shall we continue discussion on the measures? I'm sure we should continue the discussion on the measures to make them more attractive and to make sure that every single one of us are happy about the measures that are being introduced. And I think that we need to provide all the population with the measures to make our transport greener. And among the measures, I haven't seen any attractive measures at all. You were mainly speaking about taxation, additional pricing, and so on and so forth. And direct taxes are also the biggest in Lithuania in the whole of the EU. And additional taxation does not make people move to greener transport. So if we are increasing taxes on the one hand, and we see that the price component or the tax component should not be higher than it is already now, there should be a measure to reduce something in that respect as well. So here I would like to invite the Ministry of Finance to join us in these discussions to discuss what can make people change their behavior. Additional taxation only makes people poor and doesn't make them change their behavior. First and foremost, we need to assess how many of those additional measures have positive impact on the economy of Lithuania. Electric vehicles are produced by Lithuania, electricity is produced by Lithuania, and if this is the case in the future, then it will be economically beneficial for Lithuania. But for the time being, we do not produce electric vehicles in Lithuania, and we do not produce enough electricity, and additional electrification is not beneficial for Lithuania as a result, because it will all have to be imported. Thank you. First, Mantas, and then Aiste. Maybe ladies first. Thank you very much, Zigmas, for all the comments. We will have our discussions later on, but I think that we shouldn't restart the discussion of the measures that have already been discussed. We do hear this about the situation on the market. We do see what are the pros and cons, but we also have some national goals set. And thanks, Mantas, for raising these issues in the discussions with the minister. And agricultural transport is also considered under the agricultural sector. But we also see that transport sector has to do with agricultural transport as well, and agricultural transport is rather highly polluting. So we have to make sure that all the institutions that are responsible for all those measures are involved properly, because different ministries are responsible for different areas in which we are striving for common goals, and we need to work together towards those common goals. Thank you. Mantas, I would like to react to what Zygmas has said. The decarbonization working groups are an informal framework, and our goal is to come in close contact and cooperation with our social partners and to hear suggestions like we hear now. And this working group is meant to also discuss the things that we want to see in the renewed National Energy and Climate Action Plan. We will also have our Environmental Agency and Energy Agency discussing the final impact on the greenhouse gases and energy balance in the future. And those discussions will be based on those renewed lists of measures that we are now working on. We will also try to think and analyze the overlapping of all those measures as well, because for the time being, we only have preliminary calculations of greenhouse gas emissions and their reduction. And now, in the future, we will have to remodel all the situations and see what is the interaction with other sectors, just to make sure that we reduce our greenhouse gases emissions to the extent that we are aiming at, by 14% or more. This is not the end of our discussions. Together with the Ministry of Energy, we will develop a draft National Energy and Climate Action Plan, renewed action plan, and together with the representatives of the society, during public discussions, you will be able to react as well. Now, concerning what Zygmas already mentioned, it is rather difficult for a number of countries in the world to develop long-term plans because of the great instability on the market. And we are now working on the monitoring system of the National Energy, Climate and Action Plan that is supposed to enable us to see which of the measures are working and which of them are not working, and what needs to be changed in cases when a particular measure is not providing us with the planned effect. So this will be done in order to make sure that we react in a timely manner to the things that are not working. And just like it has been mentioned recently, we have some measures related to the maintenance of bicycles and promotion of electric vehicle use. And we received those suggestions from our social partners. We did our best to include them into the list of measures. And briefly, just to comment, no taxes can be imposed without the participation of the Ministry of Finance. The things that we are suggesting are only ideas based on OECD recommendations as well. But we cannot introduce taxes right away without the discussion of the Ministry of Finance, and the Ministry of Finance will be included in our discussions on the introduction of taxes, certainly. What concerns transport sector and the reduction of greenhouse gases in the transport sector is topical for both Lithuania and a number of other countries. It is a very complex challenge, and we admit that. And I'm very happy about the fact that here in Lithuania, we do have a list of measures that have not been included in the new version of the National Energy and Climate Action Plan, which means that they are our alternative for the future. And this is a huge advantage, because in other countries, they use a different principle to come up with a list of measures. So since we have an alternative list of measures which were not included in the new draft of our plan, we have more opportunities for the future. And I would like to thank our social partners for their contribution, which has not ended yet. Thank you very much, Mantas, for such an exhaustive explanation. Judita, would you like to say something? I see that there is one more hand. One more participant would like to speak, and then I will finalize our discussion. Okay, Rasa, the floor is yours. I do agree that you have done a great job, but I also see that you have a lot of hard measures and very few soft measures, even though Europe promotes soft measures. And the whole of European Union encourages us to use more and more of soft measures to make sure that our inhabitants change their behavior. Don't you think so? Who would like to react? I think that the overall list of measures includes both soft and hard measures. I don't think that all what we are doing is focused on hard measures only. Aista. Rasta, could you please say a few more words about what you mean by soft measures or hard measures? When we do our analysis and assessment within the framework of our decarbonization working groups, we are striving for a complex, for a whole set of measures. For example, hydrogen or some other. We are speaking about feasibility studies, communication measures, and other measures, for example, measures that are part of our legislation, but they are not being implemented. Most probably we need to look through the implementation part as well. Some people like the separate lane for electric vehicles. This is a soft measure. Some people like it more than subsidies. Could you please say a few more words about the way you understand those measures as being soft or hard? Because soft measures might be part of a hard measure. For example, subsidies per acquisition can be supplemented with something else. Could you say a few more words on that? Well, most probably, just like one of my colleagues mentioned, you need to show that you will use a hard measure together with a soft measure. For example, not only purchasing of something, but also communication and something else. So maybe you need to find a way to show that those hard measures also include some soft aspects as well. Thank you, Rasa. You're not the only one who said that. Mantas also presented us with a wonderful picture of the current situation. We are only on the way to the renewal or to the new draft of our National Energy and Climate Action Plan. We have not finalized our work on the document yet. We are still discussing some of the measures. The final decision on some of them hasn't been made yet, and there will be changes to the lists of measures that have already been developed, and those changes will come up at the later stage once we already have the final report of our experts, when we already know the final effect on greenhouse gases, and it might be that some of the measures will appear to be ineffective. I am not talking now about the soft measures that give a zero effect, but they ensure synergy with other measures. I'm speaking about measures that might require additional financing, but they will not give the necessary synergy within the framework of the National Energy Climate and Action Plan. So we will continue working on that to achieve the best results. Thank you very much for your questions. I don't see any other hands up. It's almost 12, and I think it would be ideal time for us to finalize our meeting. I'm not saying goodbye forever, and because I already mentioned that we are only at the beginning of the process of developing a new draft of our National Energy Climate Action Plan, and only in June 2023 that we will come up with the renewed version of the plan. Until that time, we will continue working on it, and the Ministry of Environment is doing a lot in order to come up with the final version of the plan. And I see that Judith wants to say the final word. Yes, thank you very much. I would like to thank our OECD experts who participated in today's meeting as well. This the first cycle of is over. They looked at the decarbonization here in Lithuania and also analyzed the situation for the future and what is to be done by 2025. I would like to thank our social partners who provided us with a lot of suggestions. Most probably our steps have not always met your expectations, but our goal is to take an overall view of what is possible, what can be done. I would like to thank the Ministry of Transport and Communication for their involvement. This is the final stage for the working groups on decarbonization. Thank you for your contribution. But once we have the final version of the report, the final version of the decarbonization results, we will come back to you again, maybe on Zoom, or we will have live meetings just to present you with the modeling outcomes, final modeling outcomes, just to show you how the way transport sector looks in terms in the overall context of other sectors. Thank you very much for your contribution, and see you later. Thank you and goodbye.
Viso.
Ačiū.
Viso gero.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Have a great day.